Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome to all of you. So, we have been studying, we have been trying to understand that how the distribution segment has been reformed under the Electricity Act 2003, what are the promises which have been made and how those promises are getting fulfilled and ultimately the consumer getting benefits from the reform, from the liberalization of the segment. So, in today's class we will study, we will learn that what are the challenges for bringing in reform in the real sense in the distribution segment, what are the attempts made and what shall be the benefit of bringing in retail competition for the consumers of the power market. So, that is what we would be reading today, that is what we will be trying to understand. Now, when you look at the very scheme of the law, how retail supply has been defined. Now, if you look at the language section 86, section 86 describes complete chain supply of the power system. It highlights that what all sectors are involved, it highlights that what all set of activities are involved and accordingly it confers authority on the appropriate commission to determine the tariff. Now, when you look at section 86(1), it says what? Entire value chain of electricity. It talks about generation, it talks about supply, it talks about transmission, it talks about wheeling of electricity, it talks about wholesale, bulk or retail, supply of electricity. So, the law acknowledges the retail supply of electricity. That is what is indicated in the scheme of the law. But then when you look at the provision related to licensing, if you can recall, we have discussed that under the Electricity Act, 3 activities are now regulated for which license is to be obtained from the appropriate commission: transmission, generation and trading. Now, section 12(b) says that supply and distribution both are recognized under common activity of distribute. So, to distribute electricity and supplementing it with section 14, which talks about retailer and wholesaler, when you look at it, they are not been recognized as a separate entity. So, though in the value chain of electricity, wholesale supply is being considered from both the perspectives, from bulk supplier as well as retail supplier, but then when it comes to operating in the market, when it comes to participating in the power market, one has to go and obtain license. And for that, section 12 read with section 14 says that supply and distribution, they are one integrated set of activity. So, what do we infer from this reading of the law? That as far as the activity of distribution licensee is concerned, they are into both the businesses and they are integrated one. What are those businesses? That they buy electricity and they supply it to end consumer. So, this and factor brings in a challenge for the growth of the retail market in the power sector. Though the law says, and we have read, that distribution licensee can very well supply electricity through any other person, and that person can be a franchisee, and that franchisee need not take the license. But then again, as far as license is concerned, it is being given to both, for license has been given for both the activities together. So, technically speaking, distribution licensee is responsible for both to arrange the supply and to ensure that it reaches to the end consumer. So, it is all about responsibility for distribution of electricity as a retail service provider or as wholesaler to the consumer. So, they have this responsibility, and that is what we have read also under section 42 of the Act. We have read that they do have a obligation. Section 42 read with section 43, universal service obligation. Now, when you look at the role of the distribution licensee, you would find that their role is of both. They do have a role as a service provider, and they do have a role of distributor of electricity. So, they are into dual function here. They are getting the electricity from the generating units, getting it transported through the transmission network, and then they are also responsible for installing necessary electrical equipments for the consumption of electricity by the consumer, with substation, transformer, metering, and they are also responsible for billing, collections. They do have all these responsibilities under the Act. So, distribution licensee undertakes the role of a retailer and distribution. So, when distribution licensee is into retail supply, please do understand that they are doing both the functions. They are maintaining and operating the distribution network, and they are also responsible for supplying electricity to the end consumer. And there could be also a situation where distribution licensee could be a wholesaler, where it can supply electricity to another distribution licensees. Then in such a situation, it can be distributor or it can be wholesaler. It can also be a supplier for bulk consumer, big industries, consortium of industries. It can very well supply electricity for them. Now, when you look at the 2003 Act, the 2003 Act very well recognizes electricity on the lines of other commodities, other goods, other services, because that is what is the idea. Idea is to bring in the benefit of liberalization. The idea is to facilitate the growth of the power market with the help of private players. The idea is to bring in competition which ultimately will cater the interest of the consumers, and that is why the Act recognizes the distributor, wholesaler, bulk supplier or retailer. On the similar lines, But then when you talk about the license, when you talk about that what is the license which has been given, how the authorization to operate in the market is been dealt under the law, because one can operate in the market only on the basis of the license given. So, how it is happening? For that it says that there is no separate license for entering into supply business. So, to distribute and to supply is one integrated activity, and all these are considered to be a regulated business under the Electricity Act, and this comes under the umbrella of distribution business. That is what it says. Now, how it is creating a sort of bottleneck for the growth of distribution segment. And as I said in the last session, that distribution segment is the most vital segment to strengthen the power market, because it is this sector which earns revenue for all the players. Now, finer reading of the business of the licensee, distribution licensee, when you look at that, what is the nature of business they are engaged into, what all activities they are doing, you would find that they are into two set of activities. One is they are into wire business, they have a network, distribution network, and the second one is they are into supply business, retail business. Now, as per the scheme existing as on date, these two activities are integrated, interconnected for the purpose of licensing. Now, as it has been said for the transmission segment that it is monopolistic in nature, the same is the case with the wire business at the distribution segment, that it is monopolistic in nature. Why monopolistic in nature? Because you cannot expect all the players to have its own network. So, better to allow an entity to operate and operate in a transparent manner, fair manner, and at the same time that entity should be ensured a regulated return on the investment. So that as far as margin of profit is concerned, that should not be a matter of concern, and that should not adversely affect also the growth of that segment. So, wire per se appears to be, wire business per se appears to be a monopolistic in nature, where there is all possibility that the one who has already been there will continue to have an edge, and absolutely fine if that infrastructure, that wire, that network is available in a fair and transparent manner to other players by paying charges. When you recall the provisions with regard to parallel licensee, which I was discussing in the last class, I highlighted that how the provision of laying down one's own distribution system is creating a hurdle, but because for laying down one's own distribution system, for establishing one's own distribution system, it would involve cost, and that cost will certainly bring in harmful effect on the growth of the market. and that too when you have consumers divided into different categories based on their ability to pay. So, the idea is to look at these two nature of activities of the distribution licenses as a distinct set of activities. One is the wire business, other is the supply business. Now, supply business, retail business, how do you look at it? Where you are giving a choice to the consumer. That consumer has a choice from whom to buy. Purchaser will have a choice that from whom the purchaser wants to buy electricity. And then obviously, it is all about buying in bulk from the generating stations and then selling it to consumers, or the big consumers directly buying it from the generating units, which already we have in place, where large consumers, they do get the benefit of buying the electricity directly from the generating units under open access scheme, which we will be discussing. Now, when you look at the very idea, when you look at segregation, why it is needed? Because one can always make the argument that you have an open access provision in the law, which allows the consumer to choose the seller. One can always bring in this argument that we have moved away from single buyer model to multi buyer model. But then the problem is that in order to get that access, particularly for smaller business entities, particularly for smaller consumer, not the large consumer, the very a sort of agreement, a sort of consensus, a sort of facilitative approach needed from the distribution licensee. Why? Because distribution licensee would be losing out its customer, and the customer which are regular payee of the electricity bill, those who are really bearing the cost of residential consumers or agriculture consumers, that they would be losing out those set of consumers, and thus there will be a kind of conflict of interest. Conflict of interest in what sense? That distribution licensee may not encourage the application for open access in the fear that it may lose out the industrial or commercial consumer if other players are allowed to enter the market. So, that conflict of interest is there, because distribution licensee has a universal service obligation. So, obviously, it cannot do the cherry picking, it cannot identify to whom to supply, to whom not to supply, but that perhaps may be a situation for the new players, new licensee which is entering in the market. So, then what will happen to the revenue model, from where the distribution licensee will earn revenue, earn the value or the price. So, the conflict of interest is there. Conflict of interest is there. Why? Because on the one hand, it has to ensure supply of electricity to every consumer, and on the other hand it has to also facilitate open access, meaning thereby allow other players to enter the market. Now, because distribution licensee has the interest in both wire and supply business, it would prefer to not to lose supply business, particularly of large consumer, because if it loses the business, if large consumers are not buying electricity from the distribution licensee, meaning thereby that cross subsidy payment is getting imbalanced. So, conflict of interest is there. Now, this conflict of interest can very well be avoided when you do this segregation, when you make these two activities separate, when you segregate wire with retail business. And what will happen? Then you will have wire business will be run by a licensee, and then you will see multiple players entering the supply business. And certainly this will increase competition, this will give choices to the consumer, and no denial that it will certainly lead to the operational efficiency. Quality of electricity supply will be better, because the one who will be assuring quality supply will get better market, and in that perspective all the players will like to compete with each other to give the best service, the way the open market promises consumer welfare. And then if you allow retail business to operate independently of wire business, it will certainly give the necessary growth to wholesale market. There the distribution licensee will go and buy electricity for the retail supply. So, the growth of wholesale market will certainly have a positive impact on the retail market, where you would find that in that scenario much more business would happen not through long term power purchase agreement, but through shorter kind of agreement between the generating units and the distribution licensee. And it will also improve the commercial viability of the distribution licenses. What do we mean by commercial viability? Because then there will be considerable volume of exchange of electricity in the open market, and that is possible. This is possible because see, nowadays the way we are using home appliances, the pattern of electricity consumption is changing in every household. The way the government is planning for electric vehicle, the consumption pattern is going to change, and all this will bring in a competitive price only when you have a very robust retail market in place. So, that is what is the benefit of bringing in this. Now, what are the measures needed? That when you consider wire as a monopolistic activity, as a monopolistic trade, then there must be a scheme for assured return. That is what is needed, because it must be a regulated business. Why regulated business? Because the infrastructure needs to be made available to the retail licensees in a fair and transparent manner, and therefore, the responsibility of the one who has got a license to engage into wire business is just to maintain and strengthen the network. So, you can very well imagine that aggregate technical and commercial loss will also get addressed here with a better infrastructure in place, and let the tariff be determined by the independent regulatory body as it has been happening, and let the power procurement, consumer interface when it comes to billing, revenue collection, metering and all with the responsibility of the licensee of retail business. But then there is a need to draw a caution. What is the caution here? The caution is that as we know very well that a large segment of the consumer belongs to residential or agricultural sector and they are not paying the cost of supply, they are getting the benefit of subsidy, and therefore, what we need to do is that we need to really open up the market in a phase wise manner, so that let the market get strengthened. So, if you create a kind of ecosystem where wholesale market will grow, you would find that it will have a direct impact on the growth of retail market. That is what is certainly going to happen. Generator buying the electricity, generating companies buying the generating companies selling the electricity to the distribution utilities in wholesale, and then distribution utilities identifying the retail suppliers. There is something similar to how do you see in telecom sector. Now, what are the issues, what are the challenges which are happening? One important one is, as on date you have only two prominent processes in place which deals with buying and selling of electricity. That is, either it is multilateral agreement or bilateral agreement, meaning thereby that there is a sort of long term commitment. So, the necessary flexibility is missing, and because necessary flexibility is missing, the trading of electricity as a commodity is very minimal. It is only with regard to what is surplus, not of all the electricity which is getting generated. All may not be desirable also, but substantial portion is what is needed. And that is what is the inhibition of the distribution licensee, because they have entered into a PPAs with the generating units and now they have an obligation to supply electricity. So, they are discouraging any kind of open access, or they are encouraging discouraging any kind of participation of retail players. Obviously, some metro cities have advantage of this like Bombay, Calcutta and all, but then it is not really percolating to other cities. More is the trading, good for the retail market, and good for the retail market, better for the generating units, better for the consumer for getting quality supply of electricity. And retail market will also bring in the demand side management instead of supply side management. Demand side supply would, what would be the benefit? Then in accordance with the demand, there will be buying and selling would take place. So, if a particular city gets good number of electric vehicles, obviously demand would be high, and then accordingly the distribution licensee can deal with can buy the electricity from the generating units for meeting the requirements of charging those electric vehicles. The other important factor is cross subsidy. Obviously, the law says that it should be reduced in a phase wise manner, so that ultimately it is the actual cost which should be recovered, but then it will take time, and that is why it has been suggested that let there be a phased wise implementation of this. And the way the renewables are contributing in energy mix and the way the electricity from renewables are becoming competitive, there is a higher hope for retail market getting success. Now, in order to promote this, it was suggested to change the law. 2014 there was an amendment suggested, where it was said that let this wire and supply business be segregated. Let there be a choice with the consumer that they can buy from any supply licenses. But then the bill also suggested that at least there should be one government company which shall be into supply business. Now, it has its own pros and cons. Pros in a sense that at least it will ensure the supply of electricity to the marginalized section. Cons in a sense that if you have a government company, there is all possibility that government company may not supply electricity as per the actual cost, and therefore, that would bring a sort of imbalance in the market. But then the idea is that if you allow this segregation to happen, then the market will become very vibrant. It will widen the very activities. More the trading in the market, better is for the sector. Then again you find that this is this 2018, again this was suggested, where it was said that distribution licenses enter into their power purchase agreement with generation companies for the retail supply electricity, and it says that if for some reason the license is been suspended or seized, then the consumer will get the electricity from the provider of last resort, and who shall be the provider of last resort? This is what the regulatory commission will determine. That is what it says. It says that it is the regulatory commission which shall determine the tariff for supply of electricity by generating company to a supply licensee. Then there shall be intermediary company for purchase of electricity by the supply licensee from intermediary company, if this is all about how the transition shall happen. Transmission wheeling charges are to be determined again by the regulatory commission, and then for retail it says that okay, what commission shall be doing it is that only fixing the maximum ceiling. That is what they need to do, fix the maximum ceiling and then allow a kind of bandwidth to the supply licensee to supply electricity at a reasonable cost to the consumer. So, this is what they would be doing. It will introduce in a real sense the pricing of real pricing of electricity, as I said. Quality of electricity will get improved. You will find more investments, more private players coming into picture, and if network sharing is done by the supply licensees, obviously there will be better utilization of assets, and then with the assured return there will be enough liquidity at hand to maintain the network. So, as I said, if you strengthen the supply side procurement, it will bring in competitiveness, and then when supply side procurement is somewhere getting driven through the competitiveness, obviously it will have direct impact on the cost factor, and all this is doable, all this is to be done considering this very fact that every consumer pays for what the consumer is consuming, not that one set of consumer is bearing the cost for the other set of consumer. This is what is very important. So, this is all for this session, that how retail supply is important. Obviously, one may argue that how do you look at the losses which distribution licenses are in, whether it would be something about the state owning the debt and allowing the market players to only earn the profit. So, these are the questions which are certainly to be debated and deliberated, that how this segregation would not cost the public exchequer on the one hand, and on the other hand how it will also guarantee consumer welfare. Thank you.